Hello, my name is Karamalegos, and I'm going to talk to you about universal React apps using Next.js. You can, on GitHub, I am Karamalegos, and then on Twitter and Medium, you can follow me. I'm at the Green Greek. So don't worry about frantically trying to copy code or content in the slides. I'm going to share them with a link at the very end, and I have a whole repo that has the code samples and everything. So, and I will also tweet them out at the end of the day if you don't copy out the whole link. So just remember my Twitter handle. Before we really start, though, if you were here earlier today in this room, Ari forgot to give some critical information about his discount code. So you can follow him. He's a user on Twitter. His book link is fullstackreact.com, and that discount code again is ReactNext50. So who am I? My name is Karamalegos, clearly. And you can read my bio, so I won't repeat that. But in a nutshell, I'm a developer in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I love building things that help people make their lives easier. I also love teaching people, so that's why I speak. Also, these are my dogs. More importantly, these are my dogs, Priscilla and Harry, and I have stickers of them, so if you love dogs and stickers, just come find me sometime today and I will give you one. And you don't even have to talk to me about things. You can just be like, I want stickers. All right, so first I'm going to just talk a little bit about server versus client-side rendering, because I know we always have people at different levels and talks. And then I'm going to talk about the promise of universal JavaScript. And the meat of the presentation will really be in introducing Next.js, and lots of code samples will be in there. And then, of course, I will tell you how you can learn more. First off, has anyone in here used Next.js at all? Raise your hands high. So everyone else, look at these people in case there's not time for questions. They might be able to answer them as well. All right. Server versus client-side rendering. The good old days of server-side rendering. Most of us learned it first if we're older, or we didn't do just front-end first. It was dependable across multiple browsers, networks, and computer types. But alas, user experience suffered because every interaction resulted in a round trip back to the server, even if only a small portion of the page was updated. So then many of us swung in the opposite direction into client-side rendering. But now we have huge bundles and are putting the initial render performance on. Sorry, I got distracted by the screen for a second. We're putting the initial render performance burden on devices and networks that just can't handle it without severe hits to user experience. So what are we to do? Well, the promise of universal JavaScript was that we could take the best of both worlds. With Node, we now have the ability to use the same language across both client and server. Universal is just a term that describes that concept. You might have heard the term isomorphic also. If you want to get into semantics, it indicated more seamlessly switching between server and client-side rendering. But a lot of time nowadays, people just use the term universal to refer to both of those. So universal JavaScript was the promise, but in practice, this has proven to be very complex, leading to longer cycle times to ship full-featured apps. So what if we could reduce or remove that added complexity and build applications faster? And of course, this is where I introduce Next.js. Surprise. Zeit is the company that wrote Next.js, and in their words, Next.js is a minimalistic framework for server-rendered React applications. I would say server-rendered first React applications, because they also do client rendering. And the official features are that it's server-rendered by default. You don't have to do anything to set this up. There's also automatic code splitting for faster page loads. And they use a simple page-based client-side routing setup. Those top three are like the core features of the framework. And then these next three are just nice to have that they also have. So it's a Webpack and Babel-based development environment. and then it supports hot module replacement. But it's also customizable with your own configurations. It's very easy to customize those configurations, like if you have different preferences. You can also implement it with any Node.js HTTP server. I'm actually going to show an example with Express so you can see how easy it is to incorporate that for a custom server. So it's nice to list out all these features, but it's even better to see them in practice. So I'm going to dive right in. And if you weren't here at the very beginning, I mentioned you don't have to frantically copy the code because I'm sharing both the slides and the code at the end of the presentation. So you can just chill. So how does it work? Well, to get started, all we need to do is first, of course, add, I forgot my pointer's not going to work in here, but we just need to add React, React DOM, and Next as packages to our project, make an empty directory called pages, set up a really small dev script that just runs Next, and then as soon as we run our development server, npm run dev, at the index page, we get a formatted 404 page not found page. So you can see that automatically we've already gotten stuff out of the box. So in this way, it's very similar to Create React App, if you've ever used that. The framework comes with pre-configured tooling with Babel and Webpack, but it has a lot less bloat and is more simplified than Create React App. I don't have to delete a lot of things before I start using it, which I really like. So that's cool, but it would be even better if we had a page with content on this index route, right? Like, we don't want people to come to our application and get page not found. So how do we do that? Well, we create a index.js file in our pages directory. Remember that pages directory I created? And that file just needs to contain a component that represents that page. So how will we add more endpoints? Does anyone have an idea? I was a teacher, so I like asking. Pages, yeah. I mean, I know that was a very difficult question. So here, I want an about page. So I create a new file in the pages directory called lowercase about.js, and I have my about page component in that file. And the name of the file determines the URL. So if you look here on the screenshot on the right-hand side, you can see it's localhost 3000 / about, and it contains the content for that about page. So here's where one of the core features comes in. Code splitting is performed with each page. There's a buzz. Okay, you got it. So imports or components that are not used on that page are not included in the bundle for that page. So this is one of the core features. Each endpoint is automatically set up to build a separate bundle. So yeah, all you have to do to take advantage of this feature is create your files in the pages directory. Pages is the only special directory, and everything else can be organized as you like. So it's very minimal convention. You don't have to do a lot to just take advantage of the features. So if you want dynamic routes, which we'll see a little bit later, we just use query strings. And then route masking can be used for pretty URLs or for adding server-side routes, such as with Express. So if that's how we create routes, how do we move between them? Well, if you've ever used React Router, in Next.js, they also have a component called link that you can use for client-side navigation. So here I've created a navigation header component, which I've imported into both my home and about pages. You can see it at the top of the page. The link component performs client-side navigation to preserve the application state, because we don't want to lose that. And so whenever a user clicks on the link, the target route component that's mentioned in, so if you look on line, sorry, this is really low. If you look on line 6, you can, line 5, you can see that I have a link. The path is just the index route. So whenever I click that, it will first fetch that bundle from the server for that index route, and then it will render it in the client. So it's not going to do a server render then, it's going to render in the client, in the browser. But there's some special sauce here. So if you look at my second example link on line 8, you can add a prefetch attribute. And what that will do is asynchronously fetch the code for that next page after the current page is already rendered. So that's pretty amazing. So we're effectively hydrating the client with that next page component or any page component. So the user can already start interacting on the page while it loads the rest of the bundles. And it's kind of like we're starting to move into the realm of progressive web applications. Link is a higher order component, so it must contain a node such as anchor, button, or div, something that can be rendered, and any styles that you want to apply need to be applied to that node, not on the link component itself. So just to reiterate, code is split between each route or page, unless an import is shared across most bundles. But even in those cases, you can use lazy loading of modules or components to only load them on demand when or if needed. And that's a new feature in version 3. So what if you want to load data when the page loads? The API provides a special lifecycle method on the page component called getInitialProps. So here you can see that I want to load on my index route the Star Wars characters, and I'm using the Star Wars API. And I use a simple async await method, it's so small and low, to grab that data, and then from getInitialProps, I return an object with the people in it, and you can see at the top in the index component, I have access to that people prop. So getInitialProps is an asynchronous static method, and it fetches anything that resolves to a JavaScript plain object and then populates it into the component's props. For initial load, it's executed on the server. So when someone first comes to that endpoint, it's executed on the server. It's executed on the client whenever using client-side navigation. So if they navigate to it later, it's actually fetched from the client. If you need access to the path name, query, the request response, you have access to that in a context object for the method. So now that we have some data, let's look into dynamic routes, which I promised you earlier. We are going to convert this people list to a list of links. And then when we click on that link, it will go to a page with more info about that character. So dynamic routes are created using query strings, like I mentioned earlier. The first step to set up that query string is to set up the link path with a query string. So if you look here, on my people component, I have, on line 10, I have my link component, and I've added a path, which is the character path with a query string of ID is equal to the person's ID in the Star Wars API. Next, I need to create the character page. So here I have the character.js file in the pages directory, and it contains a component that will render my very basic person name, homeworld name, and their birth year in the Star Wars realm. And getInitialProps, I populate that data. So my example is a little bit contrived just because I wanted to keep this example application very basic and just focusing on Next.js. I didn't set up application state or anything that's a little bit more efficient. But what I really should have done is hook this up to my GraphQL play application with the Star Wars API. I like Star Wars, so I always use this as an example. But we'll save that for another day. So you can see here I had access to the query object in getInitialProps. And that's how I grab the ID on line 16 and use it in my fetch from the Star Wars API. And then at the bottom of getInitialProps, I return both the person and the homeworld data. And you can see, if you go back to the top of the page, in my character component, I now have access to both of those pieces of data. If instead I didn't need to populate data using getInitialProps, the component itself has access to a URL property, so I could have just accessed the query with props.url.query. But here I needed to fetch more data. So that's cool. Let's see what it looks like. So you can see the URL is character, and then the query ID equals 8. This is character R5D4. Which I don't even remember which one that is. Sorry, I just randomly clicked and then took a screenshot. I should have been a little more strategic about that. So his home planet is Tatooine. His birth year is unknown. I mean, he is a robot, but that's cool. But what if I want a prettier URL? That URL is kind of ugly, right? Like, objectively speaking, we're not actually searching. We want it to look like it's a regular route. So how do we do that? We do that with route masking. And the first step on the client side is if I look back at my link in the people page, you can see that my path name on the right-hand side of that link on line 10 it's still the character with the query string ID equals ID, but I can add this as attribute with what I really want it to look like, which here is /character/ID. And so if I click a link here, on the right-hand side, you can see that the URL path is now pretty in the client, and I have C3PO's data there. And if I go back and forward, everything works fine because we have access to the browser history property. But what happens if the user refreshes the page? We get a 404 page not found. Oh, everyone. Oh. Why is that? It's because the package doesn't automatically, it's determining our routes on the server side according to our page names in the pages directory. So what we need to do is build a custom API server to fix this, which sounds complex, but it's really not. So I'm going to show you so that you can see how easy it really is. So to build a custom server, first I would add, I'm using Express here, so I would add Express. If you have another one, you can totally use another HTTP server for Node. And I would also update my dev script to run Node server.js. Remember earlier, it just called Next, but now we need to go ahead and say, okay, hey, use my custom server file. And of course, I need to write the server file. This file is cut off. Of course, you can see all the code online when I share it, but I just wanted to focus on the core of it. So if you look at the top, all I do is import Express and Next. I tell it whether it's in dev mode or not, and then down here on line 14, I just set up my custom route. Everything else is like, it just catches the standard routes and uses the client-side stuff. So lines 14 through 18 are basically the core of this. So it's really simple. And I wanted to show you that just so that you could see how easy it is to create a custom server for fancier, more custom routes. So fairly painless. So in summary, I guess I'm going a little fast here, but in summary, Next.js provides an easy solution to universal JavaScript. We don't have to do all of that setup for server-side rendering and routes and code splitting ourselves. It's rapid setup. Like I said, it's pre-configured with both Webpack and Babel, but it's also still customizable. So you're not stuck with only their opinions. I also personally think it has less bloat and it's less opinionated than Create React App, which I do love both, but I like how this one's a lot simpler. It's minimal convention. The only thing that we had to do was have a pages folder, and each of the file names indicates the route. You can organize all the rest of your code as you like. If you prefer having, I don't know, all your different files and folders, do what you like. Or as we say in New Orleans, do what you wanna. That's one of our phrases, not just, I don't know, what else would be down here? What else? Automatic code splitting. Oh my gosh, so much easier. So for each page in Pages, remember, each page has a different bundle. Unless something is shared across greater than 50% of the pages. And then even in those cases, you can optimize. Like if you're not actually going to use that package, you can set up lazy loading for dynamic modules and components. And the tutorial goes through that, and I'm going to give you that link to that tutorial at the end. It's actually a really good tutorial, and it only takes like an hour or two to just blow through it. Trying to act natural when someone's doing that, it's really difficult. I just will never be good at the videos. Also, we can asynchronously load anticipated pages after the current page has rendered. I think this is kind of a killer feature, and they don't really advertise it. It's like when you scroll through the docs, you see this, and you're like, this is amazing, and they don't advertise it. I don't know why, but it's pretty amazing. And probably most amazing for this room is that we only have to write one set of universal code. The app runs on server or client, whichever is best for the current situation, which is amazing, right? So is this used in production anywhere? Zeit, the company that made this, they use it for Zeit.co, and they've been using it for more than a year and a half. Can you use Redux, GraphQL, MobX, your own styling solutions? Yes, you can. There are a ton of examples in their repo, which I'll also provide a link for that in a second. Also, they've been rapidly updating Next.js, and soon they will be publishing their roadmap for version 4. It's version 3 right now, which was literally just released like a few weeks ago, I think. And they're not focused on necessarily adding new features, but improving performance and incorporating like React 16 and better use of caching during development to avoid recompilation and things like that. So I think there's lots of good stuff on the horizon. They're just rapidly coming up with new and better, not new and better features, but new and better performance and integration with what's available in React. So resources, like I said, well first, don't just read this slide. That link at the very top is where you can find all the things. I have the code samples. The repo is the actual code samples, but in the README, I provide a link to the slides, and I put the resources directly there. Like I said, their repo itself has lots of code examples. Also, the documentation is basically just their README, and you can read through that kind of quickly, although whether you absorb it that much is questionable. So go through the tutorial and then reread that README. The tutorial is great. It's on Zeit's page. It uses Next.js. And you'll go through all the things that I didn't cover here. I wanted to focus on the things that I thought were core features. But it's fairly easy to learn. So thanks a lot.